The Wars of the Jews by Flavius Josephus. Book 1, Chapter 4. What actions were done by Alexander Jannaeus, who reigned 27 years? 1. And now the king's wife loosed the king's brethren and made Alexander king, who appeared both elder in age and more moderate in his temper than the rest, who when he came to the government slew one of his brethren, as affecting to govern himself, but had the other of them in great esteem, as loving a quiet life, without meddling with public affairs. 2. Now it happened that there was a battle between him and Ptolemy, who was called Lathyrus, who had taken the city Asochis. He indeed slew a great many of his enemies, but the victory rather inclined to Ptolemy. But when this Ptolemy was pursued by his mother Cleopatra, and retired into Egypt, Alexander besieged Gadara, and took it, as also he did Amathus, which was the strongest of all the fortresses that were about Jordan, and therein were the most precious of all the possessions of Theodorus, the son of Zeno. Whereupon Theodorus marched against him, and took what belonged to himself as well as the king's baggage, and slew 10,000 of the Jews. However, Alexander recovered this blow, and turned his force towards the maritime parts, and took Raphia and Gaza, with Anthedon also, which was afterwards called Agrippias by King Herod. But when he had made slaves of the citizens of all these cities, the nations of the Jews made an insurrection against him at a festival. For at those feasts seditions are generally begun, and it looked as if he should not be able to escape the plot they had laid for him, had not his foreign auxiliaries, the Pisidians and Cilicians, assisted him. For as to the Syrians, he never admitted them among his mercenary troops, on account of their innate enmity against the Jewish nation. And when he had slain more than 6,000 of the rebels, he made an incursion into Arabia, and when he had taken that country together with the Gileadites and Moabites, he enjoined them to pay him tribute and return to Amathus. And as Theodorus was surprised at his great success, he took the fortress and demolished it. However, when he fought with Obodas, king of the Arabians, who had laid an ambush for him near Golan, and a plot against him, he lost his entire army, which was crowded together in a deep valley, and broken to pieces by the multitude of camels. And when he had made his escape to Jerusalem, he provoked the multitude who hated him before to make an insurrection against him, and this on account of the greatness of the calamity that he was under. However, he was then too hard for them, and in the several battles that were fought on both sides, he slew not fewer than 50,000 of the Jews in the interview of Essex years. Yet had he no reason to rejoice in these victories, since he did not but consume his own kingdom, till at length he left off fighting, and endeavored to come to a composition with them by talking with his subjects. But this mutability and irregularity of his conduct made them hate him still more. And when he asked them why they so hated him, and what he should do in order to appease them, they said, by killing himself, for that it would be then all they could do to be reconciled to him who had done such tragical things to them, even when he was dead. At the same time, they invited Demetrius, who was called Eucharius, to assist them, and as he readily complied with their request in hopes of great advantages, and came with his army, the Jews joined with those their auxiliaries about Shechem. 5. Yet did Alexander meet both these forces with 1,000 horsemen and 8,000 mercenaries that were on foot. He had also with him that part of the Jews which favored him, to the number of 10,000, while the adverse party had 3,000 horsemen and 14,000 footmen. Now, before they joined battle, the kings made proclamation, and endeavored to draw off each other's soldiers, and make them revolt, while Demetrius hoped to induce Alexander's mercenaries to leave them, and Alexander hoped to induce the Jews that were with Demetrius to leave him. But since neither of the Jews would leave off their rage, nor the Greeks prove unfaithful, they came to an engagement, and to a close fight with their weapons, in which battle Demetrius was the conqueror, although Alexander's mercenaries showed the greatest exploits, both in soul and body. Yet did the upshot of this battle prove different from what was expected, as to both of them, for neither did those that invited Demetrius to come to them continue firm to him, though he was conqueror, and 6,000 Jews, out of pity to the change of Alexander's condition, when he was fled to the mountains, came over to him. Yet could not Demetrius bear this turn of affairs, but supposing that Alexander was already become a match for him again, and that all the nation would at length run to him, he left the country and went his way. 6. However, the rest of the Jewish multitude did not lay aside their quarrels with him when the foreign auxiliaries were gone, but they had a perpetual war with Alexander until he had slain the greatest part of them, and driven the rest into the city, Messalis. And when he had demolished that city, he carried the captives to Jerusalem. Nay, his rage was grown so extravagant that his barbarity proceeded to a degree of impiety, for when he had ordered 800 to be hung upon crosses in the midst of the city, he had the throats of their wives and children cut before their eyes, and these executions he saw as he was drinking and lying down with his concubines. Upon which so deep a surprise seized upon the people that 8,000 of his opposers fled away the very next night, out of all Judea, whose flight was only terminated by Alexander's death. So at last, though not till late, and with great difficulty, he by such actions procured quiet to his kingdom and left off fighting any more. 7. Yet did that Antiochus, who was also called Dionysius, become an origin of troubles again. This man was the brother of Demetrius, and the last of the race of the Seleucidae. Footnote. Josephus here calls this Antiochus the last of the Seleucidae, although there remained still a shadow of another king of that family, Antiochus Asiaticus, or Commagenus, who reigned, or rather lay hid, till Pompey quite turned him out, as Dean Aldrich here notes, from Appian and Justin. End of footnote. Alexander was afraid of him when he was marching against the Arabians, so he cut a deep trench between Antipatris, which was near the mountains, and the shores of Joppa. He also erected a high wall before the trench, and built wooden towers in order to hinder any sudden approaches. But still, he was not able to exclude Antiochus, for he burnt the towers, and filled up the trenches, and marched on with his army. And as he looked upon taking his revenge on Alexander for endeavoring to stop him, as a thing of less consequence, he marched directly against the Arabians, whose king retired into such parts of the country as were fittest for engaging the enemy, and then, on the sudden, made his horse turn back, who were in number 10,000, and fell upon Antiochus's army while they were in disorder, and a terrible battle ensued. Antiochus's troops, so long as he was alive, fought it out, although a mighty slaughter was made among them by the Arabians. But when he fell, for he was in the forefront in the utmost danger, in rallying his troops, they all gave ground, and the greatest part of his army were destroyed, either in the action or the fight. And for the rest, who fled to the village of Cana, it happened that they were all consumed by want of necessaries, a few only excepted. About this time, it was that the people of Damascus, out of their hatred to Ptolemy, the son of Menneus, invited Aretas to take the government, and made him king of Cilicia. This man also made an expedition against Judea, and beat Alexander in battle, but afterwards retired by mutual agreement. But Alexander, then he had taken Pella, marched to Gerasa again, out of the covetous desire he had of Theodorus's possessions. And when he had built a triple wall about the garrison, he took the place by force. He also demolished Golan and Seleucia, and what was called the valley of Antiochus, besides which he took the strong fortress of Gamala, and stripped Demetrius, who was governor therein, of what he had, on account of the many crimes laid to his charge, and then returned to Judea, after he had been 3 whole years in this expedition. And now he was kindly received of the nation, because of the good success he had. So, when he was at rest from war, he fell into a distemper, for he was afflicted with a quartan ague, and supposed that by exercising himself against in martial affairs he should get rid of this distemper. But by making such expeditions at unseasonable times, and forcing his body to undergo greater hardships than it was able to bear, he brought himself to his end. He died, therefore, in the midst of his troubles, after he had reigned 27 years. Book 1, Chapter 5. Alexandra reigns 9 years, during which time the Pharisees were the real rulers of the nation. 1. Now Alexander left the kingdom to Alexandra, his wife, and depended upon it that the Jews would now very readily submit to her, because she had been very averse to such cruelty as he had treated them with, and had opposed his violation of their laws, and had thereby got the goodwill of the people. Nor was he mistaken as to his expectations, for this woman kept the dominion by the opinion that the people had of her piety, for she chiefly studied the ancient customs of her country, and cast those men out of the government that offended against their holy laws. And as she had 2 sons by Alexander, she made Hyrcanus the elder high priest, on account of his age, as also besides that on account of his inactive temper, no way disposing him to disturb the public. But she retained the younger Aristobulus with her as a private person, by reason of the warmth of his temper. 2. And now the Pharisees joined themselves to her, to assist her in the government. These are a certain sect of Jews that appear more religious than others, and seem to interpret the laws more accurately. Now Alexandra hearkened to them to an extraordinary degree, as being herself a woman of great piety towards God. But these Pharisees artfully insinuated themselves into her favor by little and little, and became themselves the real administrators of the public affairs. They banished and reduced whom they pleased. They bound and loosed men at their pleasure. Footnote. Here we have the oldest and most authentic Jewish exposition of binding and loosening, for punishing or absolving men, not for declaring actions, law, lawful or unlawful, as some more modern Jews and Christians vainly pretend. End of footnote. Second footnote. Matthew 16, 19, XV, III, 18. End of footnote. And to say all at once, they had the enjoyment of the royal authority, whilst the expenses and the difficulties of it belonged to Alexandra. She was a sagacious woman in the management of great affairs, and intent always upon gathering soldiers together, so that she increased the army the one half, and procured a great body of foreign troops, till her own nation became not only very powerful at home, but terrible also to foreign potentates, while she governed other people, and the Pharisees governed her. 3. Accordingly, they themselves slew Diogenes, a person of figure, and one that had been a friend to Alexander, and accused him as having assisted the king with his advice for crucifying the 800 men before mentioned. They also prevailed with Alexandra to put to death the rest of those who had irritated him against them. Now she was so superstitious as to comply with their desires, and accordingly they slew whom they pleased themselves, but the principal of those who were in danger fled to Aristobulus, who persuaded his mother to spare the men on account of their dignity, but to expel them out of the city, unless she took them to be innocent. So they were suffered to go unpunished, and were dispersed all over the country. But when Alexandra sent out her army to Damascus, under pretense that Ptolemy was always oppressing that city, she got possession of it, nor did it make any considerable resistance. She also prevailed with Tigranes, king of Armenia, who lay with his troops about Ptolemais, and besieged Cleopatra. Footnote: Strabo, B. 16, page 740, relates that this Selene Cleopatra was besieged by Tigranes, not in Ptolemais, as here, but after she had left Syria in Seleucia, a citadel in Mesopotamia, and adds that when he had kept her a while in prison, he put her to death. Dean Aldrich supposes here that Strabo contradicts Josephus, which does not appear to me, for although Josephus says both here and in the Antiquities, Book 13, Chapter 6, Section 4, that Tigranes besieged her now in Ptolemais, and that he took the city, as the Antiquities inform us, yet does he nowhere intimate that he now took the queen herself, so that both the narrations of Strabo and Josephus may still be true notwithstanding. End of footnote. By agreements and presents to go away. She also prevailed with Tigranes, king of Armenia, who lay with his troops about Ptolemais, and besieged Cleopatra by agreements and presents to go away. Accordingly, Tigranes soon arose from the siege by reason of those domestic tumults which happened upon Lucullus's expedition into Armenia. 4. In the meantime, Alexandra fell sick, and Aristobulus her younger son, took hold of this opportunity with his domestics, of which he had a great many, who were all of them his friends, on account of the warmth of their youth, and got possession of all the fortresses. He also used the sums of money he found in them to get together a number of mercenary soldiers, and made himself king. And besides this, upon Hyrcanus's complaint to his mother, she compassionated his case, and put Aristobulus's wife and sons under restraint in Antonia, which was a fortress that joined to the north part of the temple. It was, as I have already said, of old called the Citadel, but afterwards got the name of Antonia, when Antony was lord of the East, just as the other cities, Sebaste and Agrippias, had their names changed, and these given them from Sebastus and Agrippa. But Alexandra died before she could punish Aristobulus for his disinheriting his brother, after she had reigned 9 years. Chapter 6. Book 1. When Hyrcanus, who was Alexander's heir, receded from his claim to the crown, Aristobulus is made king, and afterward the same Hyrcanus, by the means of Antipater, is brought back by Aretas. At last Pompey is made the arbitrator of the dispute between the brothers. 1. Now Hyrcanus was heir to the kingdom, and to him did his mother commit it before she died. But Aristobulus was superior to him in power and magnanimity. And when there was a battle between them to decide the dispute about the kingdom near Jericho, the greatest part deserted Hyrcanus and went over to Aristobulus. But Hyrcanus, with those of his party who stayed with him, fled to Antonia, and got into his power the hostages that might be for his preservation, which were Aristobulus's wife with her children. But they came to an agreement before things should come to extremities, that Aristobulus should be king, and Hyrcanus should resign that up, but retain all the rest of his dignities, as being the king's brother. And that stumble word, just backing up, was magnanimity. Anyway, back to it. Hereupon they were reconciled to each other in the temple, and embraced one another in a very kind manner, while the people stood round about them. They also changed their houses, while Aristobulus went to the royal palace, and Hyrcanus retired to the house of Aristobulus. 2. Now those other people who were at variance with Aristobulus were afraid upon his unexpectedly obtaining the government, and especially this concerned Antipater. Footnote: that this Antipater, the father of Herod the Great, was an Idumean, Josephus affirms here. See the note on Antiquities, 14, chapter 15, section 2. End of footnote. Now, those other people who were at variance with Aristobulus were afraid upon his unexpectedly obtaining the government, and especially this concerned Antipater, whom Aristobulus hated of old. He was by birth an Idumean, and one of the principal of that nation. On account of his ancestors and riches and other authority to him belonging, he also persuaded Hyrcanus to fly to Aretas, the king of Arabia, and to lay claim to the kingdom, as also he persuaded Aretas to receive Hyrcanus, and to bring him back to his kingdom. He also cast reproaches upon Aristobulus as to his morals, and gave great commendations to Hyrcanus, and exhorted Aretas to receive him, and told him how becoming a thing it would be for him who ruled so great a kingdom to afford his assistance to such as are injured, alleging that Hyrcanus was treated unjustly by being deprived of that dominion which belonged to him by the prerogative of his birth. And when he had predisposed them both to do what he would have them, he took Hyrcanus by night, and ran away from the city. And continuing his flight with great swiftness, he escaped to the place called Petra, which is the royal seat of the king of Arabia, where he put Hyrcanus into Aretas's hands, and by the discoursing much with him, and gaining upon him with many presents, he prevailed with him to give him an army that might restore him to his kingdom. This army consisted of 50,000 footmen and horsemen, against which Aristobulus was not able to make resistance, but was deserted in his first onset, and was driven to Jerusalem. He also had been taken at first by force. If Scaurus, the Roman general, had not come and seasonably interposed himself and raised the siege, this Scaurus was sent into Syria from Armenia by Pompey the Great, when he fought against Tigranes. So Scaurus came to Damascus, which had been lately taken by Metellus and Lollius, and caused them to leave the place. And upon his hearing how the affairs of Judea stood, he made haste thither as to a certain booty. 3. As soon, therefore, as he was come into the country, there came ambassadors from both the brothers, each of them desiring his assistance. But Aristobulus's 300 talents had more weight with him than the justice of the cause, which sum, when Scaurus had received, he sent a herald to Hyrcanus and the Arabians, and threatened them with the resentment of the Romans and of Pompey, unless they would raise the siege. So Aretas was terrified, and retired out of Judea to Philadelphia, as did Scaurus return to Damascus again. Nor was Aristobulus satisfied with escaping out of his brother's hands, but gathered all his forces together, and pursued his enemies, and fought them at a place called Papyron, and slew above 6,000 of them, and together with them Antipater's brother, Phalion. 4. When Hyrcanus and Antipater were thus deprived of their hopes from the Arabians, they transferred the same to their adversaries, and because Pompey had passed through Syria and was come to Damascus, they fled to him for assistance, and without any bribes. Footnote. It is somewhat probable, as Haverkamp supposes, and partly Spanheim also, that the Latin copy is here the truest, that Pompey did take the many presents offered him by Hyrcanus, as he would have done the others from Aristobulus, section 6, although his remarkable abstinence from the 2,000 talents that were in the Jewish temple, when he took it a little afterward, chapter 7, section 6, and Antiquities, book 14, chapter 4, section 4, will hardly permit us to desert the Greek copies, all which agree that he did not take them. End of footnote. When Hyrcanus and Antipater were thus deprived of their hopes from the Arabians, they transferred the same to their adversaries, and because Pompey had passed through Syria and was come to Damascus, they fled to him for assistance, and without any bribes they made the same equitable pleas that they had used to Aretas, and besought him to hate the violent behavior of Aristobulus, and to bestow the kingdom upon him to whom it justly belonged, both on account of his good character and on account of his superiority in age. However, neither was Aristobulus wanting to himself in this case, as relying on the bribes that Scaurus had received. He was also there himself, and adorned himself after a manner the most agreeable to royalty that he was able. But he soon thought it beneath him to come in such a servile manner, and could not endure to serve his own ends in a way so much more abject than he was used to. So he departed him, Diospolis. (5) At this his behavior, Pompey had great indignation. Hyrcanus also and his friends made great intercession to Pompey. So he took not only his Roman forces, but many of his Syrian auxiliaries, and marched against Aristobulus, by when he had passed by Pella and Scythopolis, and was come to Corea, where you enter into the country of Judea. When you go up to it through the Mediterranean parts, he heard that Aristobulus was fled to Alexandrium, which is a stronghold fortified with the utmost magnificence, and situated upon a high mountain. And he sent to him, and commanded him to come down. Now his inclination was to try his fortune in a battle, since he was called in such an imperious manner, rather than to comply with that call. However, he saw the multitude were in great fear, and his friends exhorted him to consider what the power of the Romans was, and how it was irresistible. So he complied with their advice, and came down to Pompey. And when he had made long apology for himself and for the justness of his cause in taking the government, he returned to the fortress, and when his brother invited him again to plead his cause, he came down and spake about the justice of it, and then went away without any hindrance from Pompey. But so he was between hope and fear, and when he came down, it was to prevail with Pompey to allow him the government entirely. And when he went up to the citadel, it was that he might not appear to debase himself too low. However, Pompey commanded him to give up his fortified places, and forced him to write to every one of their governors to yield them up, they having had this charge given them to obey no letters but what were of his own handwriting. Accordingly, he did what he was ordered to do, but had still an indignation at what was done, and retired to Jerusalem, and prepared to fight with Pompey. 6. But Pompey did not give him time to make any preparations for a siege, but followed him at his heels. He was also obliged to make haste in his attempt by the death of Mithridates, of which he was informed about Jericho. Now here is the most fruitful country of Judea, which bears a vast number of palm trees, besides the balsam tree. Footnote. Of the famous palm trees and balsam about Jericho and Engadi, see the notes in Haverkamp's edition, both here and in Book 2, Chapter 9, Section 1. They are somewhat too long to be transcribed in this place. End of footnote. Now, here is the most fruitful country of Judea, which bears a vast number of palm trees besides the balsam tree, whose sprouts they cut with sharp stones, and at the incisions they gather the juice, which drops down like tears. So Pompey pitched his camp in that place one night, and then hasted away the next morning to Jerusalem. But Aristobulus was so affrighted at his approach that he came and met him by way of supplication. He also promised him money, and that he would deliver up both himself and the city into his disposal, and thereby he mitigated the anger of Pompey. Yet did not he perform any of the conditions he had agreed to, for Aristobulus's party would not so much as admit Gabinius into the city, who was sent to receive the money that he had promised. Chapter 7, Book 1. How Pompey had the city of Jerusalem delivered up to him, but took the temple by force. How he went into the Holy of Holies, as also what were his other exploits in Judea. 1. At this treatment Pompey was very angry, and took Aristobulus into custody, And when he was come to the city, he looked about where he might make his attack, for he saw the walls were so firm that it would be hard to overcome them, and that the valley before the walls was terrible, and that the temple, which was within that valley, was itself encompassed with a very strong wall, insomuch that if the city were taken, the temple would be a second place of refuge for the enemy to retire to. 2. Now, as he was long in deliberating about this matter, a sedition arose among the people within the city, Aristobulus' party being willing to fight and to set their king at liberty, while the party of Hyrcanus were for opening the gates to Pompey, and the dread people were in occasioned, these last to be very numerous party, when they looked upon the excellent order the Roman soldiers were in. So Aristobulus' party was worsened, and retired into the temple, and cut off the communication between the temple and the city, by breaking down the bridge that joined them together, and prepared to make an opposition to the utmost. But as the others had received the Romans into the city, and had delivered up the palace to him, Pompey sent Piso, one of his great officers, into the palace with an army, who distributed a garrison upon the city, because he could not persuade any one of those that fled to the temple to come to terms of accommodation. He then disposed all things that were round about them, so as might favor their attacks, as having Hyrcanus' party very ready to afford them both consuls and assistants. 3. But Pompey himself filled up the ditch that was on the north side of the temple, and the entire valley also, the army itself being obliged to carry the materials for that purpose. And indeed it was a hard thing to fill up that valley, by reason of its immense depth, especially as the Jews used all the means possible to repel them from their superior station. Nor had the Romans succeeded in their endeavors, had not Pompey taken notice of the 7th days, on which the Jews abstain from all sorts of work on a religious account, and raised his bank, but restrained his soldiers from fighting on those days, for the Jews only acted defensively on Sabbath days. But as soon as Pompey had filled up the valley, he erected high towers upon the bank, and brought those engines which they had fetched from Tyre near to the wall, and tried to batter it down. And the slingers of stones beat off those that stood above them, and drove them away. But the towers on this side of the city made very great resistance, and were indeed extraordinary both for largeness and magnificence. 4. Now here it was that upon the many hardships which the Romans underwent, Pompey could not but admire, not only at the other instances of the Jews' fortitude, but especially that they did not at all intermit their religious services, even when they were encompassed with darts on all sides. For as if the city were in full peace, their daily sacrifices and purifications, and every branch of their religious worship, were still performed to God with the utmost exactness. Nor, indeed, when the temple was actually taken, and they were every day slain about their altar? Did they leave off the instances of their divine worship that were appointed by their law? For it was in the 3rd month of the siege, before the Romans could even with great difficulty overthrow one of the towers, and get into the temple. Now he that first of all ventured to get over the wall was Faustus Cornelius, the son of Sylla. And next after him were 2 centurions, Furius and Fabius, and every one of these was followed by a cohort of his own, who encompassed the Jews on all sides, and slew them, some of them as they were running for shelter to the temple, and others as they for a while fought in their own defense. 5. And now did many of the priests, even when they saw their enemies assailing them with swords in their hands, without any disturbance, go on with their divine worship, and were slain while they were offering their drink offerings, and burning their incense, as preferring the duties about their worship to God, before their own preservation. The greatest part of them were slain by their own countrymen, of the adverse faction, and an innumerable multitude threw themselves down precipices. Nay, some there were who were so distracted among the insuperable difficulties they were under, that they set fire to the buildings that were near to the wall, and were burnt together with them. Now of the Jews were slain 12,000, but of the Romans very few were slain, but a greater number was wounded. 6. But there was nothing that affected the nation so much in the calamities they were then under, as that their holy place, which had been hitherto seen by none, should be laid open to strangers. For Pompey and those that were about him went into the temple itself, whither it was not lawful for any to enter but the high priest, and saw what was reposited therein. The candlestick with its lamps, and the table, and the pouring vessels, and the censers, all made entirely of gold, as also a great quantity of spices heaped together. Footnote. Thus says Tacitus, Cn. Pompeius first of all subdued the Jews, and went into their temple, by right of conquest. Histories, Book 5, Chapter 9. Nor did he touch any of its riches, as has been observed on the parallel place of the Antiquities. Book 4, Chapter 4, Section 4, out of Cicero himself. End of footnote. With 2,000 talents of sacred money. Yet did not he touch the money, nor anything else that was there reposited, but he commanded the ministers about the temple the very next day after he had taken it, to cleanse it, and to perform their accustomed sacrifices. Moreover, he made Hyrcanus high priest, as one that not only in their other respects had shown great alacrity on his side during the siege, but as he had been the means of hindering the multitude that was in the country from fighting for Aristobulus, which they were otherwise very ready to have done, but which means he acted the part of a good general, and reconciled the people to him, more by benevolence than by terror. Now, among the captives, Aristobulus's father-in-law was taken, who was also his uncle. So those that were the most guilty he punished with decollation, but rewarded Faustus and those with him that had fought so bravely, with glorious presents, and laid a tribute upon the country and upon Jerusalem itself. 7. He also took away from the nation all those cities they had formerly taken, and had belonged to Celestria. He had also took away from the nation all those cities they had formerly taken, and had belonged to Celesyria, and made them subject to him, that was at the time appointed to be the Roman president there, and reduced Judea within its proper bounds. He also rebuilt Gadara, and had been demolished by the Jews in order to gratify one of Demetrius, who was of Gadara, and was one of his own freedmen. He also made other cities free from their dominion that lay in the midst of the country, such I mean as they that not demolished before that time, Hippos, and Scythopolis, as also Pella, and Samaria, and Marisa, and beside these Ashdod, and Jamnia, and Arethusa, and in like manner dealt with he with the maritime cities Gaza, and Joppa, and Dora, and that which was anciently called Stratos Tower, but was afterward rebuilt with the most magnificent edifices, and had its name changed to Caesarea by King Herod, all which he restored to their own citizens, and put them under the province of Syria, which province, together with Judea and the countries as far as Egypt and Euphrates, he committed to Scaurus as their governor, and gave him 2 legions to support him, while he made all the haste he could himself to go through Cilicia in his way to Rome, having Aristobulus and his children along with him as his captives. They were 2 daughters and 2 sons, the one of which sons Alexander ran away as he was going, but the younger, Antigonus, with his sisters, were carried to Rome. Footnote on Gadara. The coin of this Gadara, still extant with its date from this area, is a certain evidence of this its rebuilding by Pompey, as Spanheim here assures us. End of footnote. They were 2 daughters and 2 sons. the one of which son's Alexander, ran away as he was going, but the younger, Antigonus, with his sisters, were carried to Rome.